A growing number of congressional representatives are deciding to call it quits, the majority of them Democrats. 29 House Democrats are retiring or running for another office this election cycle. That's more than double the 13 Republican representatives who say they will not run again. The departures are adding to increasing doubts that House Democrats will be able to keep a hold of their majority. For more, I'm joined by CBS News Capitol Hill producer Rebecca Kaplan. Hi there, Rebecca. So is there a common thread for why these representatives say that they are leaving Congress now?
Well, I think we're seeing two things at play here, and some people are going to be more frank about it than others when they talk about why they're retiring. You have someone who's being frank about it. Take Jim Cooper from Tennessee, who announced last week that he's not going to run for his seat again, and that's because of redistricting. Republicans controlled the process in Tennessee, and they absolutely carved up Nashville, which was the base of his support in that district. And when he announced his retirement, he said, there's really no future for me to be able to win the way they carved up this district. Other people are citing, the desire to spend more time with family, to be done with the life of flying to Washington every week. But in reality, I think what we're seeing here is a lot of Democrats anticipating that there's a good chance they are going to lose the majority in the 2022 midterm elections. And that means the Congress they would return to next cycle, even if they win again. And I will say a lot of these people who have announced retirements are in safe Democratic seats, but it's not going to be the same. They're not going to be running committees and being able to control the legislation that's coming to the floor if Democrats lose the House. So some people are saying, I'm going to go out on a high note, pass the legislation that we did in this particular term of Congress, and then that's going to be it for me. So that's kind of the two things I think we're seeing at play this cycle. Redistricting is one big factor, and just a potential loss of power for Democrats come this fall.
Well, Rebecca, give us some perspective here. How do these numbers compare to the number of representatives retiring or leaving office in 2010 and 2018?
Well, it's interesting. Retirements and people deciding to run for other office don't always portend what exactly a wave election is that a wave election is happening or what it's going to look like. So take 2010, which was the last time the Democrats lost power in the House, just 2 years after former President Barack Obama was elected. Now, at that time, only 17 Democrats said that they were planning to retire or seek other office. And what ended up happening was Republicans won a whopping 63 seats in the House. So that was a huge flip despite a relatively small number of retirements. Take 2018, on the other hand, that was 2 years after the election of former President Trump. And at that time, you had 35 Republicans, a pretty substantial number, say that they were going to head for the exits, either to retire or run for another office. And now Democrats ended up taking back the House during that election, but it only took 40 seats that time. So you can see a big retirement number up front like we did in 2018 and a smaller but still very significant gain. You can see a small number of retirements and there can still be a flip. So it doesn't necessarily tell us exactly what's going to happen. And maybe that says to us that in 2010, Democrats didn't sense where the political winds were shifting as much as many of them may see it now.
Well, so what does this mean for the legislative agenda then, Rebecca? How will their departures affect legislation already in the works?
Well, Democrats are going to try to get as much done as they can before this fall. There's a couple reasons for that. Obviously they control both chambers right now, which gives them the most leeway to pass their legislative agenda, though we've seen that come up against its limits in recent weeks. You see Joe Manchin opposing parts of the Build Back Better agenda, the voting rights bill that they wanted to pass in the Senate. So there are still limits, but at the same time, Supreme Court justices, they are going to move very quickly to have a replacement named to Justice Breyer's seat on the court and to get that person confirmed, whoever they might be, before there's any chance they could lose their power in Congress. But what's interesting is what we might see coming up ahead is a kind of a change in the Democratic Party. They're going to see a loss of institutional power. You have committee chairs like John Yarmuth of Kentucky, who helms the Budget Committee, saying that he's going to retire after this Congress. So there are a lot of senior Democrats who have been in these positions of power for years saying that they're ready to hang up their hats and move on. It's going to make room for this new generation of leaders that we've started to meet in these current Congresses to come into power, which is something that they've been itching for a while. So we could see a lot of fresh faces. And one thing we've seen is there's a lot more frequent turnover among Republicans than there historically has been among Democrats in the last several years. So there's going to be a chance for fresher voices to start, and they may not always be as bought into the idea of bipartisanship or as patient to push their legislative agendas, as we have sometimes seen of the current Congress.
You bring up a really good point, Rebecca. But against that backdrop, you still have House Speaker Nancy Pelosi saying that she is running for re-election. So what can we expect to happen to House Democratic leadership?
That's kind of the million-dollar question right now. Now, let's just say up front, there's no way that Speaker Pelosi could realistically say she was planning on retiring at the end of the term and still maintain the power she has in her caucus. Just look at what happened to former Speaker Paul Ryan. He announced his retirement in April of 2018, and he pretty much lost all control of the legislative agenda at that point. He tried to usher through an immigration bill through the conference in June and July, and it just completely failed. He couldn't bring the factions together because they knew he was a lame duck at that point. So Speaker Pelosi is not saying that she's stepping aside. But what's interesting is we have to think back to what happened at the very end of 2018 after she hadn't just been elected Speaker, but the Democrats had just taken control of the House back from the Republicans. She had announced her intent to run for Speaker again, and a group of Democrats said they wanted to see some term limits for leadership in the House. So she ultimately struck a deal that essentially said that she would not serve in leadership past 2022. She also said that that would apply to all of the leaders, but interestingly, it was only Speaker Pelosi herself who cut this particular deal. So that means we don't really know what's going to happen with Majority Leader Hoyer and Whip Clyburn. That's kind of a wild card here because it was Pelosi's deal that she cut, and actually this deal with with term limits for these leaders, that was never actually formally ratified by the Democratic caucus. They never voted on it. So I think we still could see some senior leaders decide that they are going to stay on and try to maintain leadership positions, even if Democrats end up being in the minority in the next Congress.
That's going to be so fascinating to watch. Meantime, the prospects for Democrats in this year's midterm elections are not looking good. Remind us, Rebecca, what are the main reasons driving this?
Well, there's a few things going on here. First of all, it's always tough for the party in power 2 years after a new president was elected. We call this kind of the coattail effect of a presidential election. This is something that political scientists have looked at. Many people in Congress can be ushered in with the strength of a presidential nominee driving up traffic to voting booths, getting people more excited and engaged, and they'll vote down the ticket for whatever party they're supporting at the top level. So that can help usher more people into office. But when you get 2 years into a midterm election and there's not that president lifting things up from the top of the ticket, it becomes a heavier lift. And it becomes especially difficult, as we have sometimes seen, if that president is struggling in terms of popularity. And that is what is happening right now with President Biden. His approval number, according to the Gallup poll, is at 40%. The only person who had a lower approval number in recent history at this point in their term, former President Donald Trump. And we saw how the 2018 midterms went for the Republican Party. Not well. Even when former President Obama took that shellacking he talked about in 2010, his approval rating going into that election was about 45%, so even higher than Biden's is right now. And the other problem that can really affect these midterm elections is the economy. And we're seeing right now GDP growth has been good, almost like over 6% in December. We have seen actual people's earnings are going up, but that is being offset by inflation, up 7% in December. And that number is making people not really feel these wage gains that they've seen. It's making it much harder when you're spending more money on groceries, more money on gas. So even though the economy is doing well by a number of metrics, people aren't necessarily going to feel it in their own pocketbooks. And that can be a definite struggle for these candidates who are in the same party as the president when trying to argue that they deserve two more years in power with the president to carry out their legislative agenda.
All right, Rebecca Kaplan. Rebecca, always good to have you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Elaine.